We've been going through the life of David, and over these past few weeks, we've talked about his role as a shepherd, and we talked about his faith as he slew Goliath, and we talked about how he treated the Lord's anointed in his relationship with Saul, and we talked about true repentance. And as we go through the life of David, it's easy to see why the book of Acts and the book of 1 Samuel both tell us he was a man after God's own heart. God saw David and saw his heart, saw his faithfulness, and determined that from him the kingdom should stand forever. And as a matter of fact, when you read there in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3, as you run through those passages, you see the genealogy. One goes from Adam, one starts with Abraham, but they both run through David and the kingly line and finally come to Jesus. And so as we see all these things about David and how great and wonderful he is, I want us to spend some time this morning talking about what he did not do well. Usually this is the part that we skip. And that's how we usually do when we look back at historical figures. We look at the great parts and we kind of overlook the bad parts. But you'll have difficulty finding someone who was a worse husband and a worse father than David. As a matter of fact, many of the things which he did and many of the ways in which he lived planted the seed for destruction in the kingdom, which would come in just a little while. And so as we think about this, I want us to think about how this is the title of the lesson, how to destroy a kingdom in 3 generations. Really 2.5 generations. How to destroy a kingdom in 2.5 generations. Now, if you have studied finance at all or read much about finance, you'll find out that most people say that a fortune is lost in 3 generations. The Chinese, thousands of years ago, used to say 3 generations is how long it takes to go through a fortune. In the 1920s in America, they used to say a family will go from work sleeves to work sleeves in just 3 generations. Usually that first generation creates, the second generation stewards, that third generation consumes. And so then they were back into the level of poverty or working class once again. And economically, we see that to be the case fairly often. But spiritually, we can see that to be the case as well. Many times when we look at a spiritual generational study of people in the church, we see the grandparents who are there every single time the door is open. Whatever it may be, gospel meetings, youth rallies, whatever it is, they are there. And then you have the children who come every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, every Wednesday night, but they really don't want to be bothered with any extra stuff that the church does. Generation 3, we're there on Sunday morning. We're there Sunday night if there's nothing else happening. And Wednesday night, we're worn out from school, we're worn out from work, and we're just not there. And then the next generation, which is 4, they'll come to placate their parents and grandparents at certain times. They'll be there sometimes when, Christmas and Easter, those sort of things. But really, they're not there very much at all. Well, as you look at the life of David, you see where there's a 3-generation curse here, a 3-generation progression, if you will. And so let's talk about how to lose a kingdom in 3 generations and what it is that David did wrongly. First of all, he married for the wrong reason. So that'd be our next slide there. He married for the wrong reason. As you and I read here in 1 Samuel 18, 17 through 27, we see in that passage where he is debating back and forth with Saul. He's just killed Goliath. He is rising. People said, hey, Saul killed his thousands. David killed his tens of thousands. Saul hears that David has been anointed, and so he determines a way to keep the royal family within his family is to marry his daughter to David. That way, at least, there will be a continuation of Saul's line and David's line together. David realizes this is probably not a good idea. And so when Saul offers his daughter, he's like, no, not going to do it. And then Saul offers his second daughter, Michal. And David realizes, well, this might be a good thing. It's not the oldest daughter of Saul, so it's not that powerful of a situation. Here's his second one. And then Saul says, listen, if you go kill a couple hundred Philistines, bring back their foreskins, then you can have her. In other words, David, I dare you. I bet you can't kill this many people. And David's like, oh yeah, I can kill that many people. All right, I'll take her. I'll marry her. Not a good basis for a marriage which would be there. And you begin reading as you go along, you see where Michal and David, it just was not a good match. When David is bringing in the ark into Jerusalem in 2 Samuel 6 and verse 20, Michal becomes very offended and very angry at him because they have different thought processes on what is proper and what is good. And we read in that passage that it was a loveless marriage. They never had any children. The marriage was not a good marriage. You begin reading about David's firstborn, and you read about his secondborn and his thirdborn and his fourthborn. And what you find out pretty quickly, interestingly, 4 different mothers. David had begun marrying many different women, not because he loved them, not because he was attracted to them, but because this person is the daughter of that king, and this person's the daughter of that king. And we'll see that happen later in the days of Solomon. And then there's Bathsheba. And Bathsheba was married not because it was a popular marriage or an easy marriage. It was a cover-up. How can we be together without having to endure the sin that everybody would see if we were not together? Today, many people marry for the wrong reason. And this is something I don't think we talk about enough. Be sure when you get married that you marry a person for the right reason. Well, the question is, what's a wrong reason to marry somebody? And what's the right reason to marry someone? Well, here's some wrong reasons. You're afraid you're going to break up. You need to fix the relationship. You need to make that other person happy, so you agree to get married. You're afraid of being alone. You have reached the age of 20, and all your friends have gotten married, and you're not married, and you're old now. That could be 30. That could be 40. You need to get married in order to prove something. Do you really love this person? I want to prove to you that I love you. That's not a good reason to get married. It's practical. Hey, we're living together already. Why don't we just get married? Many times those bases of marriage do not lead to success. We're not thinking about the right reasons to get married. So what are some good reasons to get married? First, I believe you have a similar worldview, similar values. When you marry somebody who thinks like you do, somebody who has the same goals as you have, your marriage will be much easier. That's why it's so important, if you're not married, that's why it's so important that you date and marry a fellow Christian, a fellow member of the church. Because if you marry a fellow member of the church, it's a lot easier to talk about what are we going to do on Sunday. It's a lot easier to talk about are we going to give at church or not. It's a lot easier to say, well, this is why we live and have these moral values that we have. What's a right reason to get married? The person that you're dating is your absolute best friend. And there's more than just a physical attraction. You love being with that person. You can't imagine life without that person. You are two that need to become one. Number 3, it's something that excites you. You look forward to being married. You look forward to that time in which you'll be together. And number 4, it's the obvious next step in your relationship. Now, what happens if you look and you're already married and you find out you married for the wrong reason? You can still be okay. As a matter of fact, in many Eastern countries, the parents choose your spouse. Now, when I was 20, I thought that was the worst idea ever. Now that my kids are 20, I'm thinking, But you know those marriages where somebody else chooses you and you almost feel it's just random that you're put together? They actually statistically have better success than marriages do in our country. Because those people know that they need to work. Those people know that they need to gain a value system. Those people know the work that goes into making a relationship. And wherever it is you find yourself, if you're married, wherever it is that you find yourself in that relationship, as you give yourself to God and give yourself to your spouse, you can create a marriage that is pleasing to God. But when you and I step back and look here at David's relationships, we see that he did not know how to relate to women. He did not know how to treat his wives and his children. He did not understand how much that influenced his work with God. And that's one of the reasons why his kingdom fell apart. Number two, his focus was everywhere but his family. He cared about everything but his wife and his children. We look at different passages. 2 Samuel 5 is a great one. We see where he finally unites the kingdom that had been divided because some people had followed Saul. And so now God's people are together and they're all the right things that they need to be. We read a little bit later. And we see where he comes to the city of Salem and he conquers it, makes it Jerusalem, which will be the city seat which God's people shall have forever. As a matter of fact, even the end of the book of Revelation, the church is called Jerusalem. He's able to establish a city in which God will dwell. We see later in that chapter, he defeats the Philistines. Now remember, going all the way back to Judges 13, you see where Samson's role was to agitate the Philistines. The Philistines had been conquering these people for years. And so from Samson to Samuel to Saul, finally to David, David finally wins that battle. And so you run through that chapter and you see David's the greatest king ever. He has accomplished so very much. As far as a king, he is doing great. As far as a man of God, he is doing great. As far as everything that's been prophesied about him, he is doing great. But then you begin reading about David a little bit more closely. You know when the first real conversation he ever has with one of his children seems to be, that's recorded for us, it's on his deathbed. He finally decides, Samson's going to be the guy that follows after me. So he brings Samson in. Or it's Samson. Ooh, that's the other way. Solomon. He brings Solomon in. And he begins telling Solomon, this is how you become king. This is what you need to do. This is how you need to live. And at that very last moment, he is working with Solomon, teaching him what he should have been teaching Solomon 40 years earlier. But he did not do as well as he should have. How many of us, honestly, spend our time on the things that aren't important and leave neglected the things that truly are important? We work in our career and we get promotion after promotion after promotion. We rise up, maybe don't become the president of the company, but we become a very important part of that company. And we sacrifice blood and tears and sweat to finally get there. And then when we die, we're replaced in 5 minutes. Many people work on getting and accumulating more and more stuff and better things and all these sort of things that come along. And when we die, it's nothing more than a garage sale. Because nobody really else likes our style. Nobody else really likes our stuff necessarily. We go through and we're worried about what everybody thinks about us and our place in the community and how absolutely important we are. And we're afraid that anybody might ever talk about us. And little do we realize that everybody else is so busy that not only do they not talk about us, they don't even think about us. All the while, our spouses don't see the love from us. They don't see who we truly are. We don't take time to grow with those people who love us, who care for us, who are important. All the time our children go along, and we're so busy making a life for our children that we never teach our children how to live. David was good at everything but family. And that destroyed his kingdom. And you and I today need to remember that there's two important things in life. Your soul is the only thing you're going to take with you. And your relationships on this earth are the only things you're going to really leave behind that matter. Focus on those two things, your soul and your relationship as well. Number 3, he wasn't responsible. He pursued pleasure over responsibility. I have another way of putting this. He followed his heart. His heart led him somewhere else other than where he should have been. You ever hear people talk about that? They have a loving wife, they have a loving children, but their heart leads them to another person. That's just who they're really in love with now. That's just really who's important to them now. And so they neglect that responsibility which is there. We began reading in 2 Samuel chapter 11. And in 2 Samuel chapter 11, as it opens up this key episode in David's life, we see that springtime had come, and this was when the kings had a responsibility. They needed to go defend their kingdom. They needed to go fight the other kings. There was a national responsibility that was here. David had done that every year. He wasn't in the mood. He was going to stay home. David, by this time, according to our account, had 8 wives. That's a lot of responsibility. A lot of anniversaries, right? A lot of birthdays. But instead of spending time with those 8 wives, he saw a lady bathing, Bathsheba, and brought her to him. He had a responsibility as a leader of God's people to repent, but he tried to cover it up with Uriah. And he tried to cover it up by marrying Bathsheba. And finally, it's not until later when Nathan, a prophet, points to him and says, "You are the man," that David finally takes responsibility. Have you noticed that in today's culture, people don't grow up? We don't see responsibility in our life. We just seek pleasure. We don't work hard necessarily anymore because we're too busy playing. And we don't give to God what God deserves because we're too busy looking after our own interests, our own desires, our own pleasures. When you marry, when you have children, you have a responsibility. Well, it's politically incorrect, but what is the job of a Christian husband? And what's the job of a Christian wife? What's the job of a Christian father? And what's the job of a Christian mother? Sometimes, even in church, we're afraid to talk about this because some people don't like this. They look more for the pleasure than they do the responsibility. And politically, sometimes it's incorrect to say. So we look through Ephesians 5. Here's what Paul tells us as he's talking about Christ and what he does for the church, using that for an example. Here's what Paul tells us that a Christian husband is to do. First of all, he is to provide for his wife. The word used in many translations is nourish her, much like an animal would nourish its child. What does it mean to provide? Well, making money is a good thing, but that's not really just what that passage is talking about. It's talking about providing what your spouse needs, 1 Corinthians 7. It's talking about loving that spouse. It's talking about being there for that spouse. It's talking about growing with that spouse, providing and nourishing that spouse. Secondly, we see that a husband is to cherish or protect his spouse. How do you cherish something? When something is important to you, you keep it safe. When something truly matters to you, you make sure that it is well taken care of. That's the way it should be as far as husbands taking care of their wives. They cherish them. They protect them. They care enough to do what they can to make their lives better. We see another passage tells us that they cleanse them from every spot and wrinkle. This is an idea of discipline. Not a discipline as far as physical discipline that you would do with children, but it's the idea or the mark of being someone who encourages strongly godly living, being what God wants people to be. Revelation chapter 3 and verse 19 speaks to the same thing as Jesus is talking to the churches. He talks about how he keeps it without spot and blemish. And we see 1 Peter 3:7, husbands are to know and to honor their spouse. They are to love their spouse with all their heart, to take care of their spouse, to honor their place in society, and to see the importance of the wife and the mother in the home. Now, what is it that wives are to be? Go back to Ephesians 5. They are to be a helper to their husband. You ever see a wife who's always tearing down her husband? You ever see a wife who is always trying to nitpick whatever their husband's doing wrong? They're going against Ephesians 5. Wives should be a helper to their husband. Wives should respect their husbands. Many times, for some men, that's their greatest need, is to be respected. They are to love their husbands. That idea of love is wanting what's best for that person in every situation. And they are to submit to the leadership of that husband. Many wives say, I cannot submit to my husband. That's why it's important for you to find the right man, the spiritual man, the good and kind and gentle man to marry. Now, going on, why did David lose his kingdom in 3 generations? Look at the way he treated his children. He loved, but he did not discipline. Now, we'll go through a lot of names here very quickly. And I want to tell the story more than I want to tell the names. You look in 2 Samuel 13, 21 and 25, you see Amnon. Amnon was a son of David, but he was a very angry son. He was the firstborn son. But Amnon, well, he's second-born son, his sister, Tamar, was abused by another brother. And Amnon was furious because of what had happened. And so he murdered his brother that had abused his sister. Now, when that happened, we read there in 13:21, David is furious. And you look at the root of that word, and it's talking about somebody who is shaking because he is so angry. He is angry about what his children have done. Well, what does he do? Nothing. He doesn't do anything. You look a little bit later and you see Absalom, who rebels against David, partially because of this whole situation that had just happened. And he rebels against David, and he takes David's wives, and he takes David's value, all the things that are important to him, and he tries to kill David. And what's David say? Oh, please don't hurt my son. Please don't allow him to die. And in a way, we can look at that and say, no matter what, a mother and a father are always going to love their children. But what we see here with David is he's so busy being king, he's so busy finding other wives that he never cares enough for his children until they totally blow up. And then when his children truly do blow up, he doesn't take care of that situation either. Let me tell you a secret. The opposite of love is not hate. We think love and hate are the opposites. They're not. The opposite of love is indifference. It's not caring one bit about that person. The opposite of love is indifference. And when you raise a child and you don't care what that child is doing, you don't lead that child up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. When you leave that child and don't pay attention to that child and laugh whenever that child does the opposite of what that child needs to be doing, you're not loving your child. Love includes discipline. Love includes guidance. Love includes helping that child grow to be what he needs to be. David didn't hate his children. It was worse. Indifference. That's why it's so important for us to be involved in our kids' lives. You need to know who your kids' closest friends are. You need to know what your kids' favorite activities are. You need to have times where you and your kid will talk back and forth, spend time and open up. And many times they're teenagers and they may not want to talk. But find activities, find ways to where they will share with you. Don't be indifferent to your children, but love them. Lastly, and this is a little bit off the subject of our lesson, he raised kids just like himself. Now, there's a difference here. He raised kids who grew up, and those kids followed their perception of who David was. Now, you can have a person who's going through life, and you may not know who that person truly is. They just follow the perception. Solomon followed the perception of David. He was a righteous person, religious person, but there in chapter 3, he prayed for wisdom. There in chapter 5, he built a temple. The very next chapter, he begins building his palace, which happens to be a little bit larger than the temple. He starts marrying wives, and it's more than 60. It's now hundreds of wives and hundreds of concubines. Solomon also, just like his father, was bad at relationships. He was susceptible in his relationships. And his wives caused him to leave Jesus. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, married Maacah. Maakah. I think that's how you would say it, Maacah. Maacah was the daughter of Absalom. And as you begin saying about Rehoboam, you see that he followed just like David, followed just like Solomon, and began marrying people who led him away from God. And it was further and further and further. Now Maacah will be the wife of Rehoboam, will be the queen mother, will be the grandmother to the next king. And finally, the final king throws her out because she's introducing idolatry. He married a woman who had nothing to do with God. Why? It's what he saw his father do, and it's what he saw his grandfather do. And all these consequences, all these things fell right through in every opportunity. It's interesting where we see that David lost his kingdom because he married for the wrong reason. He focused on everything but his family. He followed his heart and not God because he was indifferent to his children and because he raised kids who were just like him. Now, you look up there, and that's a pretty condemning list, right? And maybe we look at that list and we think, oh my goodness, maybe I've not done things the way I need to. Maybe I've messed up. Oh, I'm not the parent I want to be. And every parent can look back at experiences in their life and say, I wish I'd done this differently. I wish I'd done that differently. But even in spite of all these things we see that have gone wrong, that have happened, I want us to focus and notice that David was still a man after God's own heart. David was still a man who was a follower of God. And he may not have had the best marriages, and he may not have raised the children in a way that he should have raised his children, but he was still a man after God's own heart. And I want us to remember today that even when we make mistakes, even when we don't have families that we perhaps would want to show off or compare to anybody else, it's still our family. It's still our place. And we're still following God. God's a God of grace. God's a God of mercy. God is a God of love. And we can always work in the ways in which we have to influence our children, to influence our marriages, to try to be who God has called us to be in our relationships and in our lives. And that's what God calls us to do.